I never thought a single knock on my door could unravel my world. But life has a cruel way of catching you off guard. It was my brother, David, the very person I'd spent a lifetime trying to escape. Standing there in the rain, looking like a shadow of the man I once knew. His hands were shoved into his pockets. His shoulders slumped in an unfamiliar way. For the first time, David didn't radiate the cocky confidence I had grown to despise. He looked lost. "Please, Ryan," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I need to talk." Everything in me wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him that he'd already taken enough from me. My childhood, my peace, and the family I'd tried to build. But something about the way he stood there, drenched and silent, stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the last shred of brotherly love I didn't even know I had left. "Talk," I said, my tone colder than the night air. David hesitated, his eyes darting to the empty hallway behind me. "Can I come in?" "No," I said firmly. "You want to talk? Do it here." He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his wet hair. "Ryan, I don't know where else to go. I'm in trouble." Trouble. That word followed David like a shadow, ever-present and relentless. As kids, he was the one who'd set fire to the neighbor's shed, who stole money from Mom's purse, who lied, cheated, and somehow always landed on his feet. Trouble was his constant companion. But this time, there was no swagger in his voice, no sly grin, just fear. "Not my problem," I said, starting to close the door. "Wait," he blurted, stepping forward. "Ryan, please. It's about Jake." Jake. The name hit me like a gut punch. My son. No, my supposed son, who I had adored for years before finding out the truth. The betrayal still stung, raw and festering. David had slept with my wife, Karen, and father Jake, all while pretending to be the doting uncle. The truth had come out like a slow, agonizing poison, unraveling the life I'd built and leaving me standing in the wreckage. "What about Jake?" I asked, my jaw clenched. David's face crumpled. "He's sick. Karen called me. She thinks he needs both of us." I stared at him, the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. The audacity of him, standing here as if he had any claim to the title of father. "Jake has one parent left," I snapped, "and it sure as hell isn't you." David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm not here to fight," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve anything. Not your trust, not forgiveness. But this isn't about me. It's about Jake." For a moment, I considered slamming the door anyway, letting David deal with the fallout of his own mess. But Jake's face flashed in my mind. His bright eyes, his gap-toothed grin, the way he used to fall asleep on my chest as a baby. Despite everything, I couldn't turn my back on him. "Fine," I said, stepping aside. "But don't think for a second this changes anything." David nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief as he stepped into my apartment. He looked around the small space, taking in the bare walls and mismatched furniture. I could feel his judgment, even if he didn't voice it. But if he wanted to play the part of the penitent brother, he was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. "Sit," I said, gesturing to the worn couch. David obeyed, sitting on the edge of the cushion like a man waiting for a verdict. I stayed standing, arms crossed, keeping the distance between us. "Start talking," I said. David hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Karen called me last night. She said Jake's been asking about you. He's confused. He doesn't understand why you're not there anymore." The words cut deeper than I expected. I had stayed away, not because I didn't love Jake, but because I didn't know how to face him. How do you look at a child you raised as your own, knowing he isn't really yours? Knowing the truth would shatter his world? "What do you want from me, David?" I asked, my voice strained. "I want us to figure this out. Together," he said, looking up at me with those familiar, pleading eyes. "For Jake's sake." The idea of working with David, of trusting him even for a moment, felt impossible. But Jake deserved more than my anger, more than the shattered pieces of the life we'd built. He deserved a chance. I'll think about it, I said finally. David nodded, though I could see the disappointment in his face. He wanted more, reconciliation, redemption, but I wasn't ready to give him that. Not yet, maybe not ever. He left a short while later, his shoulders hunched against the rain as he disappeared into the night. I stood at the window, watching him go, my mind a tangled mess of memories and regrets. I thought of Jake, of Karen, of the years I had spent building a life that turned out to be a lie. And for the first time, I wondered if there was any way to put the pieces back together, or if some things were simply broken beyond repair. The following morning, I couldn't shake the conversation with David. It clung to me, making my coffee taste bitter and the sunlight through the window seem too harsh. My phone buzzed on the counter, and my stomach twisted when I saw Karen's name. I hesitated before picking it up. Ryan, she began, her voice tight, as if she'd been crying. Jake keeps asking for you. Please, can you just come by? He doesn't understand why you're gone. I closed my eyes, leaning against the counter for support. He doesn't understand because you haven't told him the truth. There was a long pause, the kind that screamed of guilt. I didn't know how, Karen admitted. He's just a kid, Ryan. I thought maybe you'd want to be the one to tell him. Her words hit me like a slap. I clenched my fist, the weight of responsibility crushing me. I'll come by, I said finally. But not for you. For him. I hung up without waiting for a response, the knot in my chest tightening. This wasn't about Karen or David. It was about Jake. I told myself that as I drove across town to the house I used to call home. When I arrived, Karen opened the door, her eyes red and puffy. She stepped aside to let me in without a word. The house looked the same, our photos still on the walls, Jake's toys scattered across the floor. It felt like walking into a museum of a life I no longer belonged to. Jake was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his favorite stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. His face lit up when he saw me, and for a moment, everything else melted away. "Dad!" he cried, throwing his arms around me as I knelt beside him. I hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of his shampoo. "Hey, buddy, how are you feeling?" "Better now," he said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. Karen lingered in the doorway, watching us with an unreadable expression. I ignored her, focusing on Jake as we talked about his favorite TV show, his school friends, and the new book he'd been reading. For a while, it almost felt normal. Almost. But normal was a fragile illusion, and it shattered the moment Jake asked, "Why don't you live here anymore?" Karen froze, her hand gripping the doorframe. I felt the weight of her gaze, but I couldn't look at her. Instead, I focused on Jake, my heart breaking at the confusion in his eyes. "It's complicated," I said finally, "but I'm still your dad. Okay? That will never change." Jake nodded. Though his little brow furrowed with questions, he didn't yet know how to ask. I wanted to protect him from the truth for as long as I could, but I knew the day was coming when he'd demand answers. Later, when Jake fell asleep, Karen and I sat in the kitchen. The silence between us was thick, oppressive. She fiddled with her coffee mug, her nails tapping against the ceramic. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "You're angry," she continued. "I get it. I don't blame you. But I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen." I scoffed, the bitterness spilling out before I could stop it. "You didn't mean to sleep with my brother? Or you didn't mean to get caught?" Karen flinched, but she didn't argue. "I was lonely," she admitted. "You were working all the time, and David, he was just there. He made me feel seen." "Seen," I repeated, my voice rising. "Karen, I was working my ass off to give you and Jake a good life, and you repay me by shacking up with David." Her eyes filled with tears, but I refused to feel sorry for her. "I know I screwed up," she said, "but I'm trying to fix it. I want to fix it." "Fix it?" I laughed bitterly. "Karen, there's no fixing this. The only reason I'm even here is because of Jake." Her shoulders slumped, defeat etched into every line of her face. For a moment, I almost felt pity for her. But then I remembered the months of lies, the betrayal, and the life she'd ripped apart. David came to see me, I said, changing the subject. Karen's eyes widened. What did he want? He says he wants to make things right. For Jake. She laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. David doesn't want to make things right, Ryan. He wants control. He always has. Her words rang true, but they also stung. She knew David better than I ever had, and that knowledge twisted the knife in my chest. He said you won't let him see Jake. Karen's jaw tightened. Because he doesn't deserve to. He's not stable, Ryan. You know that. I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't know what to believe anymore. David's pleas for redemption, Karen's remorse. They all felt hollow, like actors playing parts in a tragedy I never signed up for. That night, I left the house feeling more conflicted than ever. Jake had fallen asleep with a smile on his face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. But it was fleeting, swallowed by the storm of emotions that followed me home. A week passed before I saw David again. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, a sheepish expression on his face. I've been thinking about Jake, he said. I want to be in his life, Ryan. I want to be a better father. I stared at him, my anger simmering beneath the surface. You think you can just waltz in and play dad after everything you've done? I know I don't deserve it, he said quickly. But I'm trying to change. I've been seeing a therapist. I've started volunteering. I'm trying, Ryan. His words sounded sincere, but sincerity was a currency David had long since devalued. Why now? I demanded. Why not years ago, before you destroyed everything? He hesitated, his eyes dropping to the floor. Because I was a coward, he admitted. I thought taking what you had would make me feel better, but it didn't. It just made me hate myself more. For a moment, I saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he always tried to hide. But it wasn't enough to erase the damage he'd done. If you want to be in Jake's life, I said, my voice cold, you're going to have to earn it. And that starts with respecting the boundaries I set. David nodded, his expression resolute. Whatever it takes. But as I watched him leave, a part of me couldn't help but wonder. Was David truly capable of change? Or was this just another one of his games? Only time would tell, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stick around to find out. David didn't show up unannounced again, and for a while, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. I focused on Jake, trying to rebuild the trust he had in me. Every time I saw his face light up when I visited, a pang of guilt hit me. No matter how much I loved him, the truth hovered over us like a storm cloud waiting to break. Karen called less frequently, which was both a relief and a source of anxiety. I wondered if she was finally coming to terms with the mess she'd made, or if she was pulling away because she had given up entirely. The house I used to live in felt less like home and more like neutral ground, a place I visited but couldn't claim as my own anymore. A month passed before David reached out again. He asked to meet at a diner near my apartment, and against my better judgment, I agreed. When I walked in, he was already seated in a booth, nervously drumming his fingers on the table. Thanks for coming, he said as I slid into the seat across from him. I'm here for Jake, I said flatly. David nodded. I figured as much. The waitress came by to take our orders, and we both mumbled something about coffee. The silence stretched between us until the cups arrived, steaming and bitter. David took a sip, then set the mug down, his hands gripping it tightly. I've been thinking a lot, he began. About everything. About what I did to you, to Karen, to Jake. I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I was selfish, he admitted. I wanted what you had, and I didn't care who I hurt to get it. But it wasn't just jealousy, Ryan. It was envy. You always had this way of making things work, of being the good one. Mom and Dad always compared me to you, even when they pretended they didn't. I raised an eyebrow. You're seriously going to blame this on our parents? No, he said quickly. I'm not blaming anyone but myself. I need you to understand why I was the way I was. Why does it matter? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Understanding doesn't undo the damage. David flinched but didn't argue. You're right, he said quietly. But if there's any chance of making this right, I need to start by being honest. About everything. I took a sip of coffee, letting the silence linger. Go on. He hesitated, then said, I haven't seen Karen since the night I told her I was done. She didn't tell you, did she? I shook my head. What are you talking about? David exhaled shakily. After Jake was born, Karen and I stayed in touch, but it wasn't serious. I thought I could just walk away, let you two have your life back. But Karen, she didn't want that. She kept pulling me back in, making it harder to let go. Don't you dare try to make her the villain, I snapped. You're just as responsible as she is. I know, David said, his voice cracking. But you need to know the whole truth. The waitress came back to refill our cups, and we both fell silent until she left. When David spoke again, his voice was softer, almost pleading. The night I ended things with her, I told her she needed to choose. Me or you. She chose you. His words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. She chose me? I repeated, incredulous. David nodded. She said she loved you, that she wanted to fix things. I was angry, and I said things I shouldn't have. I told her I didn't care about Jake, that she could have him and her perfect little family. It wasn't true, Ryan. I care about him more than anything, but I didn't know how to deal with any of it. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of something real in David's eyes. Regret, maybe, or fear. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I don't want to keep lying, he said. Not to you, not to myself, and definitely not to Jake. I leaned back in my seat, the weight of his confession pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to believe him, to see this as a step toward redemption. But another part of me, the part that had spent years cleaning up his messes, wasn't ready to forgive. I don't know what you expect me to do with this, I said finally. David sighed. I don't expect anything. I thought you should know. We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the diner filling the space between us. Finally, I stood, throwing a few bills on the table. I have to go. David looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Thanks for listening. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. As I walked out of the diner, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and something that felt almost like relief. David's words didn't fix anything, but they left the door open, just a crack, for the possibility of something better. The next time I saw Jake, he was sitting on the swings at the park, Karen watching from a bench nearby. His face lit up when he saw me, and he ran over, his arms wide. Dad! He cried, his voice filled with joy. I scooped him up, holding him close as my heart swelled. Hey, buddy. I missed you. As I held him, I realized something. It didn't matter how he came into my life, or what blood ran through his veins. He was my son, and I would fight for him no matter what. Karen approached hesitantly, her hands stuffed into her pockets. Thanks for coming, she said softly. I nodded, not meeting her eyes. Jake needed me. She looked away, her expression a mix of guilt and gratitude. He always will. As I pushed Jake on the swings, his laughter filling the air, I felt a strange sense of peace. My life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. Not for Karen, not for David, but for Jake, and for myself. Thanks for watching. What would you do in Ryan's place? Drop a comment and check out more gripping stories on our channel.